Hi guys, today I want to show you how I make my miniature pizzas. These are polymer clay with chalk pastels, a small amount of clay glaze, like acrylic glaze, and a lot of textures and details. So the first step, of course, is to make my dough. And I'm using some Sculpey clay. It's just cream mixed with translucent, trying to get an unbaked dough color. So I'll go ahead and pat that out. And I use a lot of like jewelry cookie cutters. So I'm going to make a fairly small version just so it'll be easy to view on this camera. Okay. So the first thing I do is I add a little bit of texture. You can use just about anything to add texture. I've just got a toothbrush here. I use a lot of clay tools. So we're just getting a few little undulations in the crust. And I usually go back and I stretch it out a little bit more. So if you're thinking about scale, you know, the crust is actually going to be pretty thin for a pizza, unless it's like a deep dish or something, but okay. I think the biggest thing with making fake food is knowing when you need a whole lot of detail and when the detail can just kind of be implied. So, for example, I think it's important on the pizza, you know, to have the little holes in the olives and to add little bits of parsley and grease on the pepperonis. Those are all things we kind of look for, you know, if we're imagining a real pizza, right? But things like these little peppers and the mushrooms and the onions, I spend a lot less time because the idea of them is implied on a supreme pizza. So it's really just a little bit of translucent clay with my chalk pastels over top of them. But you kind of get the idea. Okay, so I'm going to kind of roll this crust up. And I am actually making a much smaller version than these two. So the other trick with making fake versions of food is you want to take your time and you really want to think about, you know, details like, okay, how does crust bake up? Does it bake perfectly even, or is there some undulation in the crust and, you know, maybe some bubbles? So it's roundish, but not perfect, which is just fine for me. Okay. I use a variety of tools to kind of sculpt my surfaces. You can use just normal clay tools. I buy specific tools for polymer clay. It kind of just depends on what you have. But also I use, like, you know, sandpaper for texture and a toothbrush and a clay needle tool. So you can really use anything. Squish out this middle again here. Okay. Okay, so now the fun part. I've got the crust kind of going here. Add a little bit more detail. When adding textures, you want to work kind of gently, because you can always add more texture, but you don't want to overdo it. now the fun part. Got the crust kind of going here. So I'm gonna use a variety of just chalk pastels. I don't buy anything expensive. I think mine came from Hobby Lobby. They were like 20 bucks. But you kind of want to work in layers. Because if you think about how things are baked, you know, they cook more on the outside than the inside. You know, there's going to be an obvious color change. So the nice thing with working with polymer clay is it's fairly forgiving and you can kind of build up your surfaces. Okay, again, just, you know, a normal little paintbrush. You can use whatever you have laying around. And you really want to work this into the clay. As it bakes, the chalk pastels really become fused with this polymer, which is great because even if you don't seal it, the colors stay pretty true. Again, thinking about how some areas are going to bake up more than others. Okay, let me adjust my light here a little bit. Okay, now that I've got some color going, I'm going to go back and add a little bit more texture. I love using the toothbrush for adding texture, but also if you have just a really stiff bristled brush, sometimes that's the best texture of all. Again, just a super cheap brush. I think everyone has one of these laying around if they've ever bought craft supplies. This is what really gives a super fine texture. It's also important to try to move your clay around quite a bit. So, you know, clay has memory and you want it to kind of curl up and move when you're, well, baking it or firing it. Polymer clay you bake to 275 degrees, about 30 minutes or so. Just depends on what you're using. Okay, so now we've kind of built up this surface. Add a little bit more brown to get a couple areas that are a little bit darker, and we'll work on the inside. Okay, so the areas that are starting to kind of curl up more are going to be darker brown. You're thinking about how actual food would bake in the oven. Okay, perfect. Okay, so for the sauce, depending on what you have laying around, I generally use liquid clay and I add colorants to it. That's how I did this batch. But the other thing you can do is, if you don't have access to a lot of materials, you can kind of just fake the surface. So what I do, I'm going to kind of fake it, is I'm going to paint the sauce directly onto the crust. So I'm using just a few of my chalk pastels. Again, you could do this with water in the chalk pastels. I'm going to use just a little bit of liquid clay because I have it sitting in front of me. And I'm just going to mix that up. And you want the color to be pretty saturated, but if you think about pizza sauce, again, on the edges, it's going to be more brown. It's going to be a lot more sparse. So I'm going to add a little bit of brighter sauce in the middle, and then actually add a little bit more colorant to kind of mute this down. little bit of dark brown. Just imagine how it looks when it bakes. A little bit more deep red. Sorry for the scraping noise, that's really awful. Okay. Again, it's figuring out how much detail to add and what you actually just want the eye to kind of fill in. So you don't even have to cover the whole thing in sauce, but it should also not be perfect. Okay. And sometimes I go back and add a little bit of darker color in the middle, because if you think about how cheese would be moving across the surface, you know, there's going to be some thin spots, and it's going to be a lot lighter. Okay, so now I already have some of my sauce mixed up, or excuse me, some of my cheese, and it's just my translucent clay, oops, with some liquid Sculpey clay. And again, you don't want it to be perfect, so I'm going to kind of drizzle it along here. Oops, get my golden doodle hair out of there. Dog hairs in all of my work. Okay, and a little bit goes a long way. So even though it doesn't seem like there's that much here, I'm going to scrape all of this down, and it'll probably be just enough. Okay. So then I'm going to kind of just move this around. I'm trying to only touch the surface and not dig in with my X-Acto knife. Okay. So now I want to kind of adjust that surface a little bit. You don't want swirls. You kind of just want the cheese to look like it's kind of melted over top of that sauce. So I'm kind of going back, just moving it to look a little bit more natural. Okay. Now, it looks pretty bright. So what I like to do is I don't really mess with it too much at this stage, because the toppings are going to go on and it's going to change the appearance quite a bit. But I do like that baked cheese look. So once this is baked in the oven, I'm actually going to go back with my chalk pastels, and as you can see along the crust here, I've just darkened right along the edge with the chalk pastels. Okay, so there's your cheese pizza. Thinking about toppings, the first step I like to do is add a little bit of chalk pastel scraped on, so it looks like basil or parsley. You know, again, it's the idea, so it doesn't have to be perfect. I add Parmesan cheese, which if you really think about Parmesan, it's not exactly white. So I actually use this really light kind of cream color to kind of offset it from the cheese. And once it hits it, it all kind of blends in and it looks like Parmesan. Okay, I go a little bit heavy on the Parmesan because a lot of it will either kind of disappear and soak in to the cheese, or some of it gets kind of dusted off of the crust. So I kind of push them in. There we go. Okay, now for toppings. I think the easiest thing to do is to get a little bit of clay. So if you're making pepperonis, you will start with some kind of reddish brown clay, and then I actually just take kind of chunks of other clay bodies, well, or I guess in this case, polymer clay bodies. So a little bit of brown, I'm gonna stick those together. A little bit of translucent clay. So we're trying to create some dimension here. Okay, so now I'm just gonna kind of rip it up and smush it all together. You want to be able to see the difference in all the colors. So I'm not mixing it, I'm just kind of ripping it up and sticking it back together. Okay, and then I'm gonna make a little cane, like so. I'll go ahead and move these aside. And usually if I'm gonna do this for a piece and not just a demo, I'd spend a lot more time kind of chopping up these translucent chunks so it looks a little bit more like fat, kind of integrated in the whole thing. But this will work for this example. All right, and then I'm just gonna cut really thin little slices. Okay, so at this point, let me flip that one over. I had kind of a dark spot. I'm going to kind of just get a bunch of these little pieces and set them aside, and then go back and kind of flatten out the insides. And actually, I'm going to go a little bit smaller than this, I think. So if you do one and you don't like it, you can always do more. Okay. Yep, that size is much better. And in this case, the thinner the better. If you want it to look realistic, you gotta go really, really small. Again, you don't want them too perfect. If you think about pepperonis, they're a little bit thicker on the outside, darker on the outside, thinner on the inside. And there is one pepperoni. So I'll go ahead and do that for all of these. Of course, you could do this with any meat. These are actually a little bit darker than I usually do. I think they look a little more like salami, but that's okay. And of course, you don't want them to be too perfect because real food isn't. As far as mushrooms go, I already have a little piece of really light colored clay that I've mixed with translucent clay. So when it bakes, it's gonna be a little bit more transparent. And then I went ahead and, if I can get it turned over here. Okay, so I put some chalk pastels on the back. I'm just gonna chop these up. Again, this is one of those things where, you know, the fact that it's a mushroom is implied, so it doesn't have to be too perfect. But I do like to give these just a little curve so they kind of set up when I put them on. After that, we'll do the same thing for the onions. For the sake of time, I won't do the peppers right now. Okay. For the onions, I've got another piece right here. Same deal. Onions I like to do a little bit longer so you can kind of think about the curve of the onion. And again, if they little pieces break off. It's kind of whatever. Doesn't have to be perfect. Okay. Oh, might curve a little bit more. Okay. Breakfast meats like sausage. I like to take a little bit of my clay. I'm going to mix that with some gray and some translucent clay. If you think about breakfast meats, you know, of course, well, don't think about them too hard, but they are kind of grayish brown in color. They're not really bright and warm. Okay, got my gray here. And this I'll mix down a little bit further. We don't want to really see that gray. We just kind of want a nice even color. I do like when the little bits of fat show through though, so I won't mix it too much. Okay, so again, when you're thinking about textures of things, sausage, ground hamburger, anything like that, on a scale this size, is just going to look kind of fuzzy. And if you start doing it and you realize that it's too flat, just get a different tool. My favorite tool for making any type of meat is actually my needle tool. And I just kind of stick my clay there and just tear off sections. So the trick with this is after you do it, let it sit for a couple minutes, because it'll harden back up. It's a little bit warm for me mixing the colors. Okay, once I kind of get it going, I would usually let this sit for a while, but I just take off little sections. So if you think about like a ball of sausage, it's kind of round, but has some weird kind of edges to it. So that's exactly what we're gonna make. I'm gonna take off, I guess, the high points. There we go. Oops, got a mushroom stuck to that one. Again, if you don't like the colors or it doesn't seem quite as realistic as you want, you can always go back with more colorants once you bake it in the oven and just kind of keep doctoring it up until you get it the way you like it. This is a slow process, so I'm sorry it's taking so long to make. A lot of times if I'm working on a bunch of polymer clay orders, I'll have a lot of this stuff made up ahead of time, so I'm just kind of making a composition versus starting from scratch and having to make all the objects too. Okay, and there you have it. So once this is baked in the oven, I'll go back and I will add a little bit of color and kind of darken up some of these sections so it looks a little bit more like I've broiled the cheese. And I'll hit my crust one more time, and that'll be about it. Thanks for watching. If you would like to see more of my finished work, you can go to jencoleceramics.com, and I have all of my polymer clay items on there as well as the pottery. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.